So for the base category, we don't have a split. I don't have it with me for the Edison versus contract. However, for the incremental inspection and repair activities, it is one of the appendices that we provided as a part of SCE 5, and that information starts on page D3.
And can you tell me what the numbers are, since we're there? This is for incremental steam generator expenses.
Correct. The total for engineering was $94,646,000.
I remember that. Okay. So during 2012, did Edison track, for accounting purposes, reassignment of staff from base O&M activities to incremental steam generator replacement activities?
Yes, in the manner that I just described. If they were working on the inspection activities, their base or their cost would first go to base, and then once they reached the amounts in the base, then they would be allocated and charged to the incremental cost.
So everything other than contractors was handled that way? Every cost other than outside consulting was handled as you described on a month-to-month basis, where it was charged as base to a certain level and then to incremental?
Correct. Any contractor specifically assigned there would be charged incremental. Any material specifically brought on board to support the inspection and repair activities would be charged to the incremental.
Okay. On page 44, here we're talking about rad chemical control.
Okay.
And on lines 14 through 19, you describe a number of RadChem activities, and previously you'd noted that it was labor expense to maintain the staff. Two questions on this. How was the rad chemical activity, how were the rad chemical activities different in 2012 than they were in 2011?
They weren't very different because we still needed to maintain chemistry of these systems. We needed to perform tests to identify what contaminants or what the conditions were of the systems that had water in them, for example.
Right, I understand generally what you've said that they do. My question is, did they do anything different in 2012 than they did in 11? The implication being as a result of the fact that the units were not operating.
Actually, I think, for example, radiation protection performed more activities because there were a lot more entries into the containment structures to perform the eddy current testing, as an example.
Okay.
What current testing?
Eddy current.
EDDY. Okay. So while you were continually monitoring plant systems in 2012, did the Rad Chemical Organization discover any items which required repair?
Any of the employees there at the plant, as they're walking throughout the plant, if they identify something that is leaking, they would have created a notification of that item. They would have also, in this group here, reported any of their instruments or systems that were not operating properly.
Okay, let me ask it a different way. Do you have an understanding of the range of reportable items that occurred in 2012 out of the RadChem organization?
I don't have a list of what they reported in 2012.
Do you have a general understanding of the kinds of things that came up during 2012 in that organization?
No, I don't.
Okay. Who would have that information?
Mr. Palmasano may know, but otherwise I could investigate that and get back to you.
My inquiry goes to whether there were unique items that occurred in 2012 that this came to the attention of the RADChem organization, because this is the big monitoring of material, right, of the radioactive material. So that's what I'm looking for, is was it materially different what the RADChem organization came across in 2012 than in 2011?
Well, keep in mind that this group sets the boundaries for the radioactive areas, so they must perform studies to determine what the radiation levels are. You asked whether there was one event. Yes, there was. That was the tube leak on Unit 3, which was detected, and they had to perform their studies to determine the extent of that. Otherwise, they had to continually identify the radiation levels in the areas that workers were going into and identify the protective measures that were required to enter those areas.
All right, I'll leave this. Okay. I'd like to turn your attention to page 48. And let's see. Let's go off the record a moment, because I'm also going to refer you to another. Was asked in connection with this phase was for internal audits. I believe that was question 22. Are you aware that on September 27, 2012, there was a workplace safety inspection process audit?
No, I wasn't.
So you don't know that it occurred? You don't know that there was what the consequences or results of that audit are?
Correct, I do not know.
I thought that you were responsible for question 22.
No. No, Your Honor, that was originally Mr. Hargreaves, and
It's going to be Mr. On?
correct.
Okay, I'll save that one.
I'll let him know.
Okay, I thought we could go there because it's here. Okay, on page 50, this is in the security area. So, my question is, do the security requirements, the NRC security requirements, which my understanding is the implementing agency is NERC, is that your understanding?
For safety, security of the plant?
Yeah.
No, it's the NRC.
Right, I think they delegate through NERC, but okay. So, are there differences in the security requirements when the plant is operating and when it's non-operating?
They are the same as long as there's nuclear fuel on the site.
Okay. So there are no security regulations or requirements or equipment requirements related to the actual flow of radioactive steam as opposed to a non-operating plant.
Correct. The security group is there to ensure that people stay on the other side of the fence.
Okay. Let's go to page 54. For this functional group, 13.6 million is recorded on base O&M according to your testimony on 57. My question, first question is, what portion of this training is mandatory by the NRC under shutdown conditions?
I don't have a split of the costs in that fashion.
Can you describe for me which parts would be required under the NRC and which would not?
Generally, yes. The operator training needs to be continuing. They need to ensure that they go through the required mandatory as training is required by their license.
But that's a relatively small portion of the staff that's at issue here, right?
I don't know off the top of my head how many instructors are assigned to do the operator training. But there's also other training required for the individuals, let's say in maintenance, that perform maintenance activities on the systems. They need to go through that formal training as well. Engineers are also required to perform training as required by the NRC to ensure that they're familiar with the processes and procedures.
But you're not able to quantify what portion of that training is discretionary with Edison?
I'm not sitting here right now.
On page 66, where's my lines? Lines are missing there on my
Correct.
version. Okay. In the paragraph below the summary table, there's a sentence that starts 6 lines down. Certain functions of the Business and Financial Services Group and the Nuclear Business Administration Group also must be carried out regardless of whether it's operational. Which functions must be carried out and which do not necessarily have to be incurred or undertaken in a shutdown position?
I would say that all probably of the actions carried out by this group need to be done in either condition. For example, this group does the payroll for the employees there at the facility, as well as other activities such as the budgeting and reporting of costs, which is the basis of all of the testimony here, as well as providing administrative staff to the individuals working at the facility.
Are they hiring new people?
To the extent that individuals leave and need to be replaced, then yes, they would be hiring people.
So when you said certain functions, did you really mean to say all functions?
Can I have a moment?
Off the record.
That sentence would have been better structured if I had said all functions.
Okay. So to clarify, your understanding is that there are no functions, or rather all functions of these two groups are required regardless of whether SONGS is operational.
That's correct.
And looking back up the page at this summary table, my recollection is that you earlier testified that the $6.2 million difference between what Edison has characterized as authorized, and I've pointed out is preliminarily allowed, between that and the recorded. In other words, there was an underspending of what Edison expected to spend in this category. I believe your testimony that this is largely related to workforce reductions. Is that right?
It's partially due to that. It's also partially due to fees that were lower because of the condition of the units.
Okay. How big were the workforce reductions?
I don't have that information with me for any of the groups. I don't have a detail by group.
Okay. Refueling. On page 71, this is regarding the refueling outage. At the top of the page, in your testimony, you state that SONGS does not specifically define emergent work at the beginning of each RFO, and you determine this as you go through and see what's there. My question is with respect to Unit 2 and this RFO that was underway in January, what kind of the emergent work, is that all captured in the table of emergent capital expenditures at SCE 10, or are there O&M costs attached to that?
This discussion here is only for the O&M pieces.
Okay.
And the emergent work that's discussed here is something that we can't determine beforehand until we open up a piece of equipment.
Right, I understand. What I want to know is what it was. And is that, can you direct me to, that would be this whole set of expenses in SCE 10, starting at page 22?
That is the list of all of the RFO activities that were performed. I don't have identified the subset of these activities, which ones were emergent.
Do you have a sense of whether there were any surprises?
There's always surprises in this category as the plant systems are opened up.
Okay. Can you identify for me a couple of emergent projects that came out of the RFO that you had not anticipated?
I do not have that with me, but I can certainly get it.
Is that anywhere in the testimony?
It would be within SCE 10 in some of these orders. I just need to identify which ones those were.
Okay, so maybe this afternoon you might be able to prepare a list?
I will try to, yes.
Okay. Off the record for a minute. Tube plugging. On lines 2 to 3, you refer to tubes that showed signs of unacceptable levels of wear were taken out of service by plugging the tube at both ends. What was the standard for an unacceptable level of wear?
That is identified in our procedures. And I don't recall the number, but it's based upon the percent wear of the tube. And that I can certainly get for you at a break.
Similarly, on lines 3 to 4, Edison also identified certain tubes to stabilize as a precautionary measure. What was the criteria to decide which tubes needed to be stabilized?
It depended upon the amount of wear seen in that tube.
So it's a fixed number, X above a number or below a number was the criteria?
I believe so, yes.
And you can provide that?
Yes.
Okay. So on line 10, actually 9 and 10, you're identifying other plant modifications. And number 2 is installation of a nitrogen radiation detection system on the main steam lines to facilitate detection of any tube leakage. Was that is that applicable to both units or one unit?
I'll need a minute.
Off the record. Record?
That project is for both units. However, that project for Unit 3 is in the list of our rescheduled projects. They are capital projects.
Oh, I'm confused. It said on line 7 that you'd implemented this action. So are there any others in this list that were not implemented and were rescheduled?
On Unit 2, we did complete the installation. Unit 3's, we started it, and the completion of it has been rescheduled.
Oh, okay, so it was completed for Unit 2.
Correct.
And Unit 3 was rescheduled. Okay. And was this, why did...
I'm sorry, for Unit 2, it's scheduled to be completed this year.
So were there expenditures in 2012 towards implementing this system for Unit 2?
Yes, there were.
Do you know what they are? Can you...
Yes, it's in the testimony. It was $683,000.
$693,000. And so why did this system have to be installed?
It's just an enhancement to allow the operators to easier or more quickly identify a leak in the steam generators.
Was there any, were there any obstacles or difficulties with the system, detection system in operation in January which discovered the tube leakage in Unit 3?
No, this system just allows for a quicker identification of that problem.
And did you make the decision to install it because of the failure or the tube damage in Unit 3?
I don't recall.
Were you involved in that decision?
No.
Okay. A moment off the record, please. All right, back on the record, page 79, line 1 to 2.
Okay.
You recognize that statement regarding NRC requirements and industry standards require Edison to maintain tube integrity and so forth? You see that?
No.
All right, top of 79.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have the wrong page.
All right.
Okay.
Require Edison to maintain tube integrity such that the steam generator tubes are capable of performing their intended safety functions consistent with the plant licensing basis. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
By that statement, is it your position that Edison is required to completely maintain, repair and maintain all tubes and elements of the steam generators until there's a final decision as to their future?
Yes.
So did that decision drive your Edison's decisions to make repairs to Unit 2 and to the extent it did to Unit 3?
Yes.
Your belief that the NRC required it?
Correct.
What would be the difference between NRC requirements and industry standards in this regard?
The NRC requirement is to maintain that tube integrity. The industry standards would identify the limits as to when a tube would be considered to be required for plugging, taken out of service.
And so what is the advantage to Edison to plugging tubes in a non-operational unit? From the industry side.
At the time that we performed the plugging and stabilizing Unit 3, we were not sure of the outcome of that unit's future at that time, back in February, March. So that, we believe, was the appropriate step to take at that point in time.
What would be the consequence of not plugging them?
They would have had to have been plugged at a later time.
And that later time would be when Edison decided, if Edison decided it wanted to move forward with a restart plan?
That's correct.
How long did it take to execute the tube plugging in Unit 2? And I'm going to follow up with Unit 3. Do you need a moment?
Yes, please.
Off the record. Good.
I'd like to ask you to repeat the question. I think I have the information here.
I think that I asked how long it took to do the tube plugging for Unit 2 and then comma Unit 3.
The list of plugging required for the Unit 2 as well as for Unit 3 was an evolving process. A list was identified of which tubes, or a list was prepared that identified which tubes to plug. We would plug some tubes and, in those appropriate, insert stabilizers. At later times, it was determined that we needed to perform additional inspections in those tubes to gather more information, and so some of the tubes were unplugged and inspected again. And so that was a process that continued throughout the first half of the year and a little bit into the second half, early the second half.
So are you able to respond to the question as to the initial tube plugging before the subsequent inspections?
I don't have the date that the first plug was inserted, but I can get that.
Are we talking about days or weeks or months for the tubes that needed to be plugged?
To be identified, initially identified?
And plugged. Right. The actual physical process of going in. As I understand it from your testimony, we talked earlier about some review teams that went through and had criteria, right, about what tubes needed to be plugged, what tubes need to be stabilized, right?
Correct.
From that, one of the functional groups went out to actually plug the tubes, right?
That's correct.
So my question is that going out to plug the tubes, how long did that take? Was that a matter of days?
It would have been a matter of days to, at the most, weeks between the time that the tubes were identified and the tube plugging began.
Okay. And do you have costs broken down on that between Unit 2 and Unit 3?
For the tube plugging,
right.
I believe we have an order number in the testimony. I don't have it readily at my fingertips, but I can identify.
You might be able to identify that order number.
Yes.
All right. I'd like to turn your attention to capital projects, page 94. There's a table 17-4. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
The list of work-in-progress capital projects.
Yes.
Can you identify which ones are restart-related?
If by restart related, you mean these have to be, it would have to be implemented prior to restarting the unit?
Yes.
None of these are.
None. Are any of these related to the refueling outage?
Yes.
Which ones?
Starting from the top, outage replacements. It's like the fifth one down.
Yes. That's an RFO?
Yes. The completion of that project required that the plant be in an outage condition.
Okay.
And that's the same that I'll describe for the rest of the projects. Further down, Unit 2, replace radiators on reserve aux transformers. The one below it, pressurize the spray line check valves. Next one is Unit 2, Diamond 3 cylinder heads. Further down, they replaced the EDG generators. Well, that did not have to be done during a non-outage condition. Some of the work was performed then.
Okay.
The eddy current testing, Unit 2, Cycle 17. CCW heat exchangers, Songs 2. And actually the rest of the products down to the bottom of the list.
Okay, so the ones that you didn't identify, such as the control room upgrade, would you characterize those as base expenditures, ordinary expenditures that are not related to either the outage or the refueling project?
We don't classify them as to outage or non-outage, but your description of that is correct.
Okay. Actually, while we're on the refueling outage, okay, let's see. On page, well, go to page 103. I don't know that you need the reference, but the refueling was identified as Unit 2, Cycle 17 outage. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. In prior refueling outages, what was the period of time in which the unit came back online before another refueling outage was scheduled?
The operating period?
Right.
Typically 18 months.
Right. Okay. So do you know what the SCE requested in terms of the operating period after Unit 2 Cycle 17?
It would have been along the same lines. I don't have the exact start dates, end date and start dates.
Have you heard that, or are you familiar with the idea that it might have been scheduled for a 2-year operating period as part of Cycle 17?
My understanding is that we were considering doing that, but I don't believe that had been implemented yet.
Would that in any way change if I were to tell you that Edison has made representations that it is a 2-year cycle anticipated, would it change the kinds of activities that Edison would undertake during the refueling outage if the subsequent operational period were to be longer than before, than in prior refuelings?
Your question is, would there be additional cost or more components that needed to be maintained if the operating period were longer?
Yes.
There potentially could be, because there may be additional surveillances required that would come due at that point in time of the refueling outage.
So can you give me an example of what that might mean? All right, let me back up. When you're talking about it might change the surveillance testing during the cycle, meaning that's slightly different than what I was asking you. I was asking you, during 2012, we have a refueling outage. Certain things are on the schedule to be done. Certain things emerge. If we assume that Edison has, in this cycle, is seeking a longer operational period after the refueling outage, did that result in any expenses that were different for this refueling outage than in prior refueling outages where the subsequent operational cycle was to be 18 months?
Okay, so I think your question now is, we plan to run for 2 years after this outage. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. I was referring to up to this outage, it was the 18 months, and that's the period that I thought we were talking about. So post this outage, I believe your question is, did we have to maintain or expend additional dollars during the outage to prepare ourselves for the longer operating period?
Right. Are there additional items on the list, on the RFO list, that because of the extended operating period that was to follow?
There may have been additional items. However, I'd like to point out that the cost of the outage was the same amount or lower than prior outages that had been recorded on both units 2 and 3.
Are you able to identify at this time any of the additional activities or expenses that were incurred because of an anticipated longer operating period in cycle 17?
No.
I think that's all I have right now. I've lost track of when our last break is. Let's go off the record a moment. Judge Dedman?
Good morning, Mr. Perez.
Good morning.
Let's see. Please flip to page 83 in C4.
LJW, you might want to move your microphone a little closer to you.
Thank you. Is this clear? All right. So on lines 2 and 3 here, Judge Darling had asked you about some of the requirements for when you would plug tubes and when you would stabilize tubes. Could you tell us how many tubes were plugged and stabilized?
Yes. On Unit 2, in steam generator 2E088, 205 tubes were plugged, 125 tubes were stabilized. In steam generator 2E089, 305 tubes were plugged, 226 tubes were stabilized. Did you want the Unit 3 numbers?
Yeah, please.
In Unit 3's E088 steam generator, 420 tubes were plugged, 341 tubes were stabilized. Steam generator 3E089, 387 tubes were plugged, 306 tubes were stabilized.
Then just to be clear, those are the final numbers. You mentioned earlier that some were plugged and then unplugged for further testing.
These are the final ones.
Those are the final numbers. Okay, thank you. All right. Now, I'd like to ask you to open SC10, the section on question 2 is the inspection and repair activities memo.
Page?
Sorry, my version doesn't have page numbers. Oh. All right, can you hear me? That's better. All right, thank you. I apologize.
I believe, Your Honor, page 13. That's right. I see question 3.
Yeah, I apologize. Mine isn't labeled.
You want that?
Sure. Yes. So page 13 is the first page of question 2.
Okay.
Or, excuse me, question 3. All right. So, Mr. Perez, I'm going to just kind of ask you to explain what some of these line items are. And this may be a somewhat tedious process, so I apologize for that. But I just want to make sure the record is clear what these items are. So the first 2 lines here, the eddy current testing and tube plug for Unit 2. This is what we were just talking about in SC4, correct?
Correct. I just want to point out that the initial eddy current inspection was charged to capital, and so this eddy current testing that is discussed on these first 2 lines are for subsequent eddy current testing.
Okay. To make sure I understand that, in SC4, on page 94, there's a table that you were just discussing with Judge Darling, and there's a eddy current testing U2C17 line here.
Correct.
Is that the capital charge you're referring to?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. All right. And then few lines down on the same page, there's U2 direct steam generator work DEO. Could you describe what that is briefly?
The DEO stands for Design Engineering Organization. So this would have been for the support that they provided during the inspection and repairs activities.
Okay.
Please boom your answer, Mr. Perez.
Okay.
So that is support that SCE's engineering group provided to the outside consultants in the analysis? Is that correct?
I'd have to dig one layer down to determine if there's any vendor cost in here, as well as potentially some material costs.
Okay. Right. And then about halfway down the page, there's Unit 2 SG return to service. Could you describe that briefly?
I don't know the scope of that one. I'd have to look at the details of the order and get back to you.
Okay. Well, I'm not really looking for details of the orders so much as just kind of a general understanding of what this item might. Is that a possible answer now?
No. I would have to look at the additional information.
All right. And then the immediately following line, sub-order tracking costs for, I think that's auxiliary boiler?
Correct. When we did our testing at normal operating pressure and temperature, we contracted to bring auxiliary boiler onto the facility to be able to heat the plant up.
A little further down, Ariva engineering support activities.
Other than what's in the description, I don't have additional information for this one.
You want to identify for the record what Ariva is?
Ariva is one of our consultants that has expertise in steam generators.
And then slightly further down, there's another line that appears to be eddy current testing plugs and stabilizers. Can you tell me how this is different than the second line at the top? Please.
I believe the difference would be that this has the stabilizers, whereas the first one does not have the stabilizers.
Okay. And then second line from the bottom, 2E089 split stabilizer. Describe that.
Again, that would be some of the cost associated with the purchase of the stabilizers that were inserted into the tubes.
And then flipping to the next page, the last one before engineering total, VLPMS. Could you describe that acronym and as well as the line?
I'll need a moment for that one.
Off the record.
Off the record.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Should move you here.
You're welcome to continue going on the record off the record.
It is ever.
Yeah. Well, keep it close by.
Bound, literally. Keep me away from the microphone.
I don't know how I ended up with a copy of everything that doesn't have page numbers, but... Oh, this is... Thank you. Unfortunately, my highlights are all in the unpaid.
Right, but at least you can look at them.
Yeah.
Anything I can do to help?
Oh, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay, back on the record?
The acronym VLPMS stands for Replace Vibration and Loose Parts Monitoring System. And this would have been the O&M associated with that capital project.
Thank you. All right, and then towards the bottom of the page, I guess third line up from the bottom, is Phase 1 U2 steam generator repair. Note that we're now under the nuclear support functional group. Could you describe that?
I don't have any additional information other than the description of that order.
Okay. And then flipping to the following page, page 15. There's U2 and 3 return to service division support. That's also under the nuclear support functional group.
I don't have additional information other than that description.
All right, so that gets us all the way through Unit 2. So one, I guess, general question about all the items in these tables. Is there, they're broken out by Unit 2 and Unit 3. Are there any of them that are better characterized as shared to both units or common facilities of the plant?
Most of the work that was carried out for the repair activities was specific to a unit, and so it can be charged there. Some of the groups do provide common support, as you mentioned it, for example, the Nuclear Support Organization. And if their time cannot be identified specifically to a unit, then it may be prorated to the unit counts.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now moving on to the first page of Unit 3, which is page 16. So there's 2 lines, I guess about halfway down, that are U3 and then the numbers from the steam generators, PCT and tube plugging, Feb 2012.
Okay.
So am I correct that those are analogous to the lines we talked about earlier for Unit 2? Or is there something different here?
It would be the same.
It would be the same. So the others were just not labeled by February. So with these, the numbers are quite a bit lower than the analogous numbers for Unit 2. Could you tell us why that is?
No, I don't have that information with me.
Okay. And then the last line under the engineering functional group is support steam generator recovery, offload U3 reactor. Could you tell us what that means?
That was the activity to take the fuel out of the reactor and put it in the used fuel pool.
Excuse me for a second while I flip through and try and find the page number of my next question for you. Okay, on page 19. about a quarter of the way down, there's a line set up to recirc, I think this stands for secondary condensation system.
Correct.
Yeah. Is that could you explain that in context of this being an incremental O&M project? What happened here? Why was this incremental?
I'd have to go study that one. I don't know here.
All right, and then let's flip to the last page, page 20. So the third line from the bottom in the first functional group is install and remove nozzle dams. What does that refer to?
Nozzle dams are a piece of equipment that's inserted into the steam generator that allows for the eddy current inspections to proceed while there is fluids in portions of the reactor coolant system.
Can I just ask why that costs $865,000?
We had to purchase the nozzle dams as opposed to just renting them for the outage.
So is that a one-time expense that would have been used in future refueling cycles?
We will be able to use them in future refueling outages, yes.
So further down this page, under the RAD-CHEM control, just so I understand, the first three lines here are all about U3 forced outage support. Could you explain what those represent?
Those would be costs that we discussed a little while ago for these organizations to identify radioactive levels or the chemistry level of fluids and identification of the boundaries and the protective clothing required to enter those radioactive areas.
Okay. And then above that, in the operations group, the middle two lines are emergent work. How is that, I guess, the same or different than the emergent work we discussed in the RFO section?
Well, the emergent work in the RFO was specifically for Unit 2.
Thank you. All right.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Please.
So, just as a follow-up to that, you have this emergent work that is continuing to emerge all the way through November and December relative to Unit 3. I thought that this was in a preservation mode by that time, and yet there are continuing charges. Can you tell me whether there was work continuing to be done, or was repair work? Emergent is unexpected, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so what kind of unexpected repair work was emerging in the last quarter of 2012 if the Unit 3 was in preservation mode?
That's when we started putting the unit into a preservation mode. It takes time to drain the systems, identify the systems, what we can do to the systems, and then start that layup process. It is a process that takes a while, and operations would have had to supported that drain down and layup process. So it was a process that went over the 6-month period.
So you define it as emergent because it was the layup process, which is outside of your expectations?
Correct.
Okay.
Can you describe what the layup process means?
Layup is to put the plant in a state that would not result in degradation of the fuel. So that means that we have to identify which systems can be drained of fluids or taken out of service. And so taking the system out of service, for example, you would drain the fluid, the water, and then you may determine that you want to backfill it with some kind of inert gas to minimize or prevent corrosion.
Okay. Am I correct in understanding that the way layup is different than preservation is that layup is for a relatively short duration outage?
I think we've been using the term interchangeably.
Okay. All right. That's all I have on that document. So, Judge Darling, do you have any follow-ups on those tables?
No.
Okay. In that case, Mr. Perez, could I get you to flip to Exhibit SC16? This is one of the letters from Mitsubishi. Yeah, and I recognize that you are going to co-sponsor this with Mr. Palmisano, so I have a few questions for you.
Okay.
Mr. Perez, are you generally familiar with the contents of this letter?
Very generally, as to
Okay.
just that this was providing some repair options, not on the specifics of it.
Okay. All right. In my copy, there's a Gantt chart on the first page after the first blue insert. So that's towards the back of the document. I think it's an attachment to the letters.
Is this, it says attachment 3 at the top?
No, at the top it says songs option 3/option 4 schedule.
It's redacted.
Yeah, the details of this are redacted in this version, but I think that's fine for my question. Okay.
I'm there.
Mr. Perez is with me? Okay. So, Mr. Perez, this is a Gantt chart that obviously the details here are redacted, but I just want you to observe the timeline across the top of the page. You take a moment and then tell us when you see that this timeline would begin.
The timeline shows that, I'm assuming that is 2013, it has a 13, and has January, well, actually has December of 2012 as the first item.
Right. Yes, I interpret it the same way. So, in context of the larger document, this Gantt chart is referring to some of the repair options that are described previously in the attachment? Is that...
My copy is redacted, so I can't tell what the activities are.
Right. I'm looking at the same copy. Perhaps it would help if we open the previous letter to... So let's actually just open the letter to the very beginning, where the actual letter is. So this is on the Mitsubishi letterhead.
Okay.
You're with me?
Yes.
Sorry, Your Honor, if I could just, is this the December 14, 2012?
Right, we're
Yes.
still on SE 16.
SE 16. Yeah. So in the last sentence of the first paragraph, the Mitsubishi states that this letter provides Mitsubishi's summary assessment of these options. And then the subject is repair and replacement options. Is that correct?
That's the subject line on this letter, yes.
Yeah. So, yes, the foundation that I'm trying to establish is that this letter as a whole is about certain repair and replacement options for the SONGS units. Is that correct with your understanding?
Yes.
Okay. Very good. So ultimately where I'm trying to go is back to that Gantt chart. My interpretation is that what is shown there is a hypothetical timeline for some of the repair and replacement options. Is that consistent with your understanding of the letter, or do we need to go through this in more detail first?
Not seeing the details of that Gantt chart, I don't know if the whatever the activities are there are for both Unit 2 and 3 or just for Unit 3.
Okay. Judge Starling has alerted me that I should define Gantt chart. I use that term to describe a project management flow chart, essentially. It lays out certain steps that have to happen before other steps, et cetera. Are you familiar with that type of document?
Yes, I am.
Okay, thank you. So the question that I would ultimately like to ask you here is, this Gantt chart begins in December of 2012. Are you aware of if any steps were taken in that month, December 2012, following this letter to implement any of the repair or replacement options that may have been laid out here?
I don't know.
You don't know. So is it, if there had been any of those steps taken, would they be laid out in the tables to SE10 that we were discussing earlier? The costs for those steps?
If we had started incurring costs to follow this here,
Yeah, if Edison had begun repair or replacement of the steam generators, I guess consistent with this letter or with some other plan of repair or replacement, any of those costs would have been in those tables to SE10.
the cost of the Edison personnel that would have been working on this would be reflected there for the month of December. However, I'm not sure of the financial situation as to who would have to pay for other than the Edison costs associated with that. So I don't know that they would have been reflected in that chart.
Okay. Let me try again. So I think I appreciate the point you just made, was that if certain steps had been paid for by MHI or others, they would not be reflected in the tables. Is that the point you just made?
Correct.
Okay. So if Edison had incurred costs, they would have been in those tables. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then, so to your knowledge, there were no steps taken at Edison's expense to do these repair and replacement in December of 2012. Is that correct?
To initiate the items identified in this letter?
Yeah.
I don't know that.
Don't know that. All right. I think that's everything I have for now.
Okay, so I think we'll break for lunch. I want to ask Mr. Weissman about a methodology for Mr. Perez to respond to some of the points that he's promised to respond to questions by Judge Dudney and myself. You could take care of that in redirect, perhaps. If you don't, I don't know if we've got time to pull exhibit together, but if he wants to, you could take care of that and redirect. Then there's opportunity for recross to the extent there's questions about that. Does that seem like a reasonable approach?
Absolutely.
Does anybody have a problem with that? Okay. All right, so when we come back, Mr. Shapson has 5 minutes or less of cross on a particular item that came up after his cross. We will then move to redirect. Okay?
Do you want an update on the sort of Vodafone availability?
Yes.
I talked to him quite extensively and explained the situation with us being a little bit behind schedule. So he has made himself available tomorrow morning between 10 and noon. He needs to start at 9:30, although that would be really early.
Okay. Okay, so we'll get him the phone number. We'll get you the phone number for here. All right. And we'll try to pick a time certain by the end of the day when I have a better idea of what it looks like for tomorrow morning. Okay? All right. Off the record, we'll be back at 1:15 to try to keep on track, see if we can make up some time.